Russia's losses continue to mount up. More than 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and now over 20,000 military vehicles, all gone thanks to a combination of Russian incompetence and Ukrainian intelligence. And Ukraine isn't stopping there. It recently baited a huge Russian force into a massive death trap, inflicting even more massive losses for the Kremlin to cope with. The incident occurred near the city of Siversk in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. The city is right on the front lines of the conflict. Russians have taken ground to the north, south and east, and they've been closing on Siversk for some time now. Their progress is far from rapid, with a recent report revealing that Russia is gaining around 440 feet or 135 meters of ground in parts of Donetsk each day. Yet, slowly but surely, the Kremlin's forces are inching closer to the city, with a potential assault set to occur sometime in the near future. That's according to the Ukrainian Center for Defense Strategies, which wrote in its operational situation update for July 28. Tactical gains by the enemy northeast of Siversk indicate that Russian troops have reached a line several kilometers from Siversk and may begin an assault on the city in the near future. However, before Russia can capture Siversk, it first needs to break through the surrounding line of Ukrainian defense. To do that, the Russians decided to send in the big guns. On July 27, they amassed a large convoy of 71 vehicles in the small village of Verkhono-Kamyanska, only a short distance east of Siversk. The convoy was made up of 6 T-72B3M tanks, arranged in 3 rows, as well as a trio of BMP-2 armoured personnel carriers, 6 MT-LB tracked fighting vehicles, an armoured recovery vehicle, 2 all-terrain buggies, 12 Lada vehicles and 41 motorcycles. In the early stages of the war, it wasn't at all uncommon to see a large vehicle-based assault force like this one. The Russians regularly deployed tanks and armoured vehicles over the border into Ukraine, bombarding buildings and relying on heavy firepower to overwhelm their opposition. But over time, the war changed. It became much more oriented around aerial attacks involving drones and missiles, like the countless drone strikes heard about daily in Ukrainian cities like Kyiv, as well as various locations along the front lines. And as drone attacks became more frequent and intense, tanks and armoured vehicles were seen less and less. Instead, Russia started to rely much more on civilian vehicles, including the likes of motorcycles and even golf carts. It has also regularly sent troops into contested frontline territories on foot, a tactic that hasn't always worked out, as evident in several recent examples of Russian soldiers marching right into the path of Ukrainian armoured vehicles and being instantly outgunned and outmatched. There are several reasons for Russia's decision to use tanks and armoured vehicles more sparingly. The main reason, quite simply, is that Russia has suffered such huge numbers of losses. When the invasion began, the Kremlin could rely on huge numbers of tanks and armoured vehicles, having assembled one of the largest ground-based military forces on the planet. It had in excess of 16,000 tanks in total, with more than 3,000 of them being fully operational and combat ready. It also had tens of thousands of armoured vehicles of various types, from fighting vehicles to personnel carriers. But Ukraine soon started to damage and destroy those tanks and vehicles in large numbers, often with the help of Western-supplied anti-tank weapons like American FGM-148 Javelin missiles. The Ukrainian armed forces have also become increasingly proficient in drone warfare, using relatively cheap and simple drones to target the weak points of enemy tanks and turn them from destructive behemoths into flaming balls of scrap metal. Russia has also been remarkably careless in its use of tanks and armoured vehicles, often deploying them into dangerous territory without sufficient support, not training drivers and operating crews correctly, and failing to account for Ukraine's all-important home ground advantage, which has allowed Ukrainian defenders to set traps and plan ambushes, catching the Russians by surprise time and time again. Thanks to all of this, Russia has seen its massive supplies of tanks and armoured vehicles diminish as the war has progressed. Estimates vary, but numerous sources agree that the country has lost around 20,000 military vehicles in total, if not more. Those kinds of losses are simply not sustainable, even for a military force as large as Russia's. These are tanks and vehicles that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each, at least, with some valued in the millions. And while Russia is working to produce more tanks and vehicles to counteract its losses, it can't afford to keep throwing such expensive equipment into the meat grinder. So it has massively eased off in its usage of tanks and armoured vehicles, resorting to desperate and sometimes bizarre measures like the aforementioned troops in golf carts. In the Siversk area, however, the Russians made the rare decision to deploy a sizable convoy, risking half a dozen tanks and numerous other vehicles. There are several ways to interpret this. On the one hand, perhaps the Russians were confident that they had nothing to fear. They might have assumed that they could send in their tanks and other vehicles, wipe out any Ukrainian stragglers in the area, and face little to no resistance. It's also possible that Russia is so desperate to gain ground in this particular patch of the front lines and capture Siversk, so it needed to send in the tanks and vehicles, hoping to claim a quick victory and push on towards more important targets like the large cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, situated deeper into the Donetsk region. Either way, their plan was clear. They intended to travel from Verkhono-Kamyanska and launch a heavily armoured assault on the neighbouring village of Zolotarivka, most likely hoping to catch the Ukrainian forces in the area off guard and rapidly overwhelm them. Unfortunately for them, the Russians were riding right into a death trap, because Ukraine's forces, specifically the 54th Mechanized Brigade and the 81st Separate Air Mobile Brigade, were ready and waiting for them. In fact, they'd been anticipating the enemy's movements for several weeks and preparing the perfect plan to surprise and annihilate them. Again, this all ties into that all-important home ground advantage mentioned earlier on. The members of Ukraine's 54th Brigade know this area well. They've been defending it since the invasion began back in 2022, and as time has passed, they've learned a lot about their enemy. Thanks to that, they had a very strong idea what the Russians were planning, which route the convoy would take, and when the attack would take place. So they prepared for it. They set up drone surveillance points along the expected route, as well as artillery coordination networks with systems ready to strike at a moment's notice. The 81st Brigade, meanwhile, wasn't as familiar with the area, but is famed for its rapid response times and high mobility. It's a unit that has proven itself more than capable in the battlefield, the perfect reinforcement to pull off a mission like this. The two brigades stealthily watched and waited for the first signs of the Russian convoy. And no sooner had the Russian tanks entered the area than Ukrainian fire began to rain down upon them. Using a mixture of drones, artillery strikes and infantry fire, Ukraine took out one target after another. The Russians thought they were rolling to victory. In actual fact, they were riding to their doom. Video footage from the scene shows the full scale of Ukraine's dominance. In the clips, numerous FPV drones are seen speeding towards their targets or dropping bombs from above. Armoured vehicles are obliterated in an instant, tanks burst into flames in the blink of an eye, and thick black smoke fills the air as Ukraine strikes relentlessly and with expert precision. It's even clear that some of the Russian vehicles had been equipped with special anti-drone protections, like metal frames welded into place around their bodies to prevent drones getting too close and striking their weak sections. But these feeble, improvised defences were no match for Ukraine's calculated counterattack. The soldiers still found ways to wipe them out, taking advantage of an infamous design flaw in the T-72 tank design. These tanks, first built back in the 1960s, feature automated loading systems. On the one hand, the presence of an autoloader might be seen as an advantage, as it means that T-72 crews only require 3 people, a commander, gunner and driver, without the need for a loader. However, for the T-72 autoloader to work correctly, it requires easy access to ammunition. Because of this, all the ammo in the T-72 tank is largely unprotected, stored in an obvious weak point just below the tank's turret. Thus, to take out T-72s, all Ukraine has to do is target the turret. By striking in the right area, they can basically blow up the tank's munitions from within, sending the turret flying into the sky and turning the crew compartment into a blazing inferno. That's exactly what they did here, as the footage shows even tanks and vehicles with anti-drone measures are quickly and efficiently targeted and destroyed. Some of the footage also shows the moment where the Russian forces realized they'd walked right into a trap and attempted to flee from the area. But their vehicles can only go so fast, and Ukraine's drones are much faster. Several Russian vehicles got stuck on the narrow path leading in and out of the battlefield, presenting an easy opportunity for Ukrainian kamikaze drones to hone in and wipe them out. In mere minutes, the majority of the Russian convoy had been obliterated. All that was left was for Ukraine's drones and light infantry units to rush in and take out the stragglers. Striking from the sides and the rear all at once, Ukraine didn't give the Russians a single second to rest, regroup, or reposition themselves. Infantry fleeing burning vehicles were quickly targeted with mortars, rifles, and explosives, and the aftermath painted a clear and definitive picture of the devastation. Almost all of the Russian convoy was destroyed, with dozens of vehicles abandoned and ablaze. Debris and wreckage littered the scene, with tank turrets and bits of armoured vehicles scattered here and there, and satellite imagery showed craters and clouds of smoke rising from the ground. A report of the attack was posted on X by Special Kursan Kat, who wrote, "Siversk front, Ukrainian 54th and 81st Brigades have repelled the first large-scale Russian armoured assault in a long time. The attack involved 6 tanks, 3 APCs, 6 MT-LBs, 14 vehicles and 41 motorcycles. Most of the equipment was destroyed or damaged. Russian infantry losses are estimated at around a company killed and wounded." To be more precise, initial estimates suggested that 48 Russian soldiers were killed in the attack, with approximately 69 others wounded, with Ukrainian surveillance drones in the skies watching as injured troops were dragged from the rubble and wreckage of their vehicles. In terms of vehicles, the losses were staggering. Just 3 vehicles survived the assault intact: a Brem armoured recovery vehicle, an MT-LB personal carrier, and a truck. In total, Russia is estimated to have lost equipment valued in the tens of millions of dollars. Ukraine, meanwhile, has not reported any major losses, using the resources at its disposal to inflict enormous damage at minimal cost. The morale impact of a victory like this should also not be underestimated. Ukraine just proved, yet again, that it's more than capable of handling whatever Russia throws its way. Even when the enemy launches a massive attack, rolling in tanks, armoured vehicles, and more than 100 troops, Ukraine's clever traps and strategic ambushes are always waiting to catch them off guard. It's a huge boost for the Ukrainian defenders and a catastrophic loss for the Russian invaders. Because the next time Russian soldiers are told to climb aboard their tanks and fighting vehicles to capture a nearby town or village, they'll remember what happened here. They'll know that makeshift defences, like anti-drone frames welded to their vehicles, won't protect them. They'll worry about where the Ukrainians might be hiding and what they have in store. They'll be fearful, and when soldiers are scared, they're much more likely to make costly mistakes, playing right into their opponent's hands. What's more, this wasn't the only example of Ukraine taking down Russian tanks in recent days. Another rare Russian vehicle-based attack took place close to Pokrovsk, a city in Donetsk that's been the site of fierce fighting in recent times as Ukrainian defenders dig in and Russians throw everything they have in an attempt to take over the city. There's no doubt that the Russians have gained ground in the local area. They've used their manpower advantage to good effect. The Ukrainian army is said to be short by around 100,000 troops at the moment, while Russia, despite suffering more than 1 million casualties, continues to have a relatively large number of active duty personnel, with tens of thousands more said to be signing up or forcefully recruited into the ranks each and every month. The sheer imbalance in army sizes has allowed Russian forces to effectively march into certain areas more or less unopposed, with Ukrainians having to concentrate their smaller numbers of troops in key locations and give up less important territory along the front lines. Because of this, Russia has taken ground to the northeast of Pokrovsk, as well as to the south, slowly but surely encircling the city and gearing up for one massive assault. And since the Russians are so close to the city, the main roads leading into it are within their range of their mortars and drones, so Ukraine can no longer safely move any vehicles in or out. It's a grim situation, and one young Ukrainian soldier, nicknamed Venya, recently summed up the gravity of what Pokrovsk is facing in an interview with the Kyiv Independent. The city is holding, but you can see what's happening on the flanks. The enemy is approaching from the side and looking to cut off the main road in. If they get much closer, we will simply have to withdraw. Unfortunately, it's just a matter of time, and once it happens, they can take the city itself without much of a fight. For the time being, however, Ukraine is still putting up a fight, a strong one. So strong that the Russians recently resorted to desperate measures in an attempt to break their enemy's resolve once and for all. They pulled old tanks out of storage facilities and deployed them towards the southern flank of Pokrovsk. There's just one problem: the Russians rolled their tanks onto a road of death. Specifically, the road that connects the Russian stronghold of Selyadov with the small village of Shevchenko, situated just a few miles south of Pokrovsk. This road has notoriously proven to be utterly unsafe for Russian tanks and armoured vehicles. Indeed, one open source intelligence analyst named Andrew Perpetua recently posted an aerial image of the area, highlighting the remains of close to 150 destroyed Russian vehicles along just a 2-mile section of road, not far from Shevchenko. He went on to add that it's a very similar story on surrounding roads. If you imagine I mapped one road, right? And it's just because there was a video of a guy driving down the road. So every single road is like that. And much of that destruction is the handiwork of just one local Ukrainian battalion from an unspecified brigade, which has relied on supporting drone teams to essentially make it impossible for any Russian trucks or supply vehicles to arrive in Shevchenko. Anytime a Russian vehicle enters the area, it's spotted and wiped out before the driver even has time to put it in reverse. But it seems that the Russians haven't learned their lesson, because they still sent a bunch of armoured vehicles along that road and towards Shevchenko. Perhaps they thought that the Ukrainians guarding the area had been weakened or retreated. Maybe they thought the time was finally right to launch a final charge rally in Shevchenko and then push on for victory in Pokrovsk. Either way, they were terribly wrong. Ukraine's 155th Mechanized Brigade was ready and waiting to wipe them out. The brigade published a Telegram post detailing what happened, complete with a video of their successful strikes on the Russian vehicles. The post read, "Coordinated actions of artillery and unmanned systems forces of the 155th Mechanized Brigade thwarted another assault on the Pokrovsky direction. For the first time in a long time, the enemy threw armoured vehicles into battle, and again in vain. The entire enemy column was destroyed. Pokrovsk stands. 155th Ombra Brigade holds the line." The accompanying video footage shows how effective and precise the Ukrainian soldiers and drone pilots were. Even as the Russian vehicles attempted to evade their attacks, with some driving across nearby fields, they were successfully hunted down and blown up, one after the other. By the end, it was a similar story as it had been near Siversk. A complete Ukrainian victory, with nothing but smouldering piles of Russian metal left scattered along the road and across the fields. It's also another example of Ukrainian drone superiority. While Russia may have more drones, producing thousands in its vast factories and throwing hundreds of them towards Kyiv and other cities on a daily basis, Ukraine is far more effective at using the drones at its disposal, including some excellent domestic models to wipe out high-value targets both on its own territory and deep behind enemy lines. Of course, the fighting won't end here. The Russians will continue to push. They'll likely launch further assaults towards Pokrovsk in the days and weeks to come. And Ukrainian intelligence also suggests that Russia's army will similarly soon attempt additional attacks in and around Siversk. They may eventually capture both of these areas. But for the meantime, at least, Ukraine is holding firm. It's making smart strategic decisions and outthinking its enemy over and over again, launching devastating surprise attacks and ambushes in the locations that matter most. Now, learn more about Ukraine's latest successes in our video detailing how the country's armed forces somehow defied near impossible odds to recapture a key location in the Sumy region. Or check out how a retired US Army general and former CIA boss thinks Ukraine and its allies can end this war once and for all. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our trusted news channel too for more day-by-day reports and in-depth video insights from the front lines of Ukraine and beyond.